It was a warm evening in a small town in the United States, and the streets were buzzing with the sound of people going about their evening routines. The warm golden glow of streetlights cast long shadows across the sidewalks, where people walked hurriedly in and out of cafes and shops, their faces illuminated by the soft, flickering lights. Among the crowd, Chris Davis, a 32-year-old former Army Ranger, walked down the sidewalk, his steps slow and deliberate. After returning from Afghanistan a year ago, Chris had transitioned into civilian life, working for a nonprofit organization that helped veterans readjust to life after service. Tonight, he was simply walking to the local bookstore to pick up a novel he had been meaning to read for months. His attire was simple, a black t-shirt, well-fitted jeans, and sneakers, paired with a small, worn backpack slung over his shoulder. As Chris crossed the intersection near the bookstore, the unmistakable sound of a police car came into earshot. The screeching tires of the patrol car broke the peace of the evening, and a moment later, the car came to a halt beside him. Officer Thompson, a white police officer with a stern look and piercing blue eyes, stepped out of the vehicle with deliberate slowness. His sharp gaze scanned Chris, sizing him up, before he barked out a command. "Hey, you in a hurry or something?" The officer's tone was sharp and accusing, causing Chris to pause mid-step and turn to meet his gaze. The confrontation was about to begin, and Chris had no idea what was coming next. Officer Cardon's voice cut through the evening air as he stepped closer to Elijah, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. "Where are you headed?" he asked sharply, his words laced with an accusatory tone. Elijah paused, turning to face the officer, his expression calm and measured. "Just going to the bookstore," he replied evenly, keeping his voice steady, not betraying any sign of frustration. Cardon tilted his head slightly, as if the answer didn't sit right with him. "A bookstore? Huh? What's in the bag?" he continued, his gaze dropping to the leather messenger bag slung over Elijah's shoulder, his eyes scanning it as though it might contain something sinister. The tension in the air was palpable. A few pedestrians slowed their pace, sensing the confrontation unfolding. Several people had stopped entirely, now watching the interaction closely. Phones were discreetly pulled from pockets, their screens lighting up as people began recording, eager to capture what was happening. Elijah could feel their eyes on him, but he didn't flinch. He stood tall, his posture relaxed yet deliberate, his hand resting calmly by his side. Elijah's response came without hesitation, his tone not one of defiance, but of quiet challenge. "Do you want to check it?" His words hung in the air, a subtle invitation that carried no fear or anger, but something else, an unspoken confidence that seemed to make the officer hesitate. Cardon's lips twitched, a mixture of surprise and irritation crossing his face. For a moment, it looked like he wasn't sure how to react. "Don't get smart with me," Cardon snapped, his voice hardening as he straightened his back and took a step closer. His hand hovered near his utility belt, as if contemplating his next move. The crowd shifted slightly, the phones still recording, their owners watching intently. Elijah remained unmoved, his gaze unwavering as he met Cardon's eyes. There was no panic in his expression, no sign of fear or anxiety. Just an unwavering calm that contrasted sharply with the officer's increasingly tense demeanor. Elijah's next words were simple, but they carried weight. "I'm just trying to go about my day." His voice was low, steady, almost as though he was speaking to Cardon, but also to the growing crowd that had gathered around them. His challenge wasn't just directed at the officer, it was a message to everyone watching. A message that no matter the circumstances, he would not be intimidated. Officer Thompson's tone sharpened as he took a step closer to Chris. "Drop the bag," he ordered, his voice firm, though there was a hint of tension behind it. "I need to check it." The command was sudden, unexpected, and Chris felt the weight of the officer's authority pressing down on him. He stood still for a moment, his eyes locking with Thompson's, before he slowly lowered the leather backpack from his shoulder and placed it gently on the sidewalk. The air between them seemed to thicken with every passing second, and the atmosphere became charged with a palpable sense of anticipation. As Chris stood there, a few more pedestrians had stopped, their curiosity piqued by the interaction. The street that had once been filled with the usual evening chatter had gone quiet, save for the sounds of shoes tapping on the pavement and the hum of the cars in the distance. Phones were discreetly pulled from pockets, the screens lighting up as they pointed toward Chris and Officer Thompson. People were watching now, really watching, and every small movement was being recorded for posterity. The tension was rising. Chris, however, remained calm. His posture was unyielding, his shoulders relaxed, but his stance was resolute. He didn't feel the need to hurry or panic. There was no sign of fear or discomfort in his demeanor, just the quiet confidence of someone who knew they had nothing to hide. As Officer Thompson reached for the bag, Chris glanced at him, his voice steady and a touch defiant. "You want to check it?" he asked, his words cool but carrying an unmistakable challenge. For a brief moment, Thompson faltered. His brow furrowed, and there was a subtle hesitation in his movements. The question had clearly thrown him off. He was expecting a compliant, intimidated response, but Chris wasn't giving him that. Chris wasn't backing down. The officer, caught off guard, shifted his weight and cleared his throat before responding, but his voice wasn't as certain as it had been. "I'll be the one asking the questions," he muttered, attempting to regain control of the situation. But Chris wasn't backing down, not even an inch. His gaze never wavered as he waited for Officer Thompson to continue. The officer's discomfort was palpable now, and it only seemed to grow as the crowd closed in, murmuring amongst themselves. Phones were now openly recording, and some voices in the crowd began to comment under their breath, their words laced with suspicion. Chris could hear snippets of conversations, people commenting on the officer's attitude, questioning why he had singled out Chris. They were all noticing what Chris had already felt. Something was off about this stop. Officer Thompson, clearly unnerved by the growing crowd and the unexpected pushback, started rifling through Chris's bag with a bit more force than necessary. Each action seemed more erratic than the last. Chris could sense the officer's discomfort, the tension mounting as the crowd's murmurs turned into whispers and then into soft calls of protest. It was clear that everyone was waiting for Thompson to slip, to reveal that this stop was more about power than it was about anything else. Chris remained calm as the tension in the air grew thicker. The crowd around him was watching with bated breath, the phone still recording every move, every word. Officer Thompson was rifling through Chris's bag, but his actions were becoming more and more erratic, almost frantic. It was as if he was hoping to find something, anything, to justify the stop, but nothing was there. Chris, sensing the moment had arrived, made a decision. He reached into his wallet and slowly pulled out his military ID. He handed it to Officer Thompson with a quiet, controlled gesture, his eyes never leaving the officer's face. "Here," Chris said calmly, his voice steady but carrying an edge of quiet authority. "I'm a veteran. Maybe that'll help you understand why I'm not the person you think I am." Officer Thompson froze for a moment. His eyes scanned the ID slowly, as though processing the information. The sudden realization hit him like a wave, and his expression shifted from one of suspicion to a subtle, stunned disbelief. His fingers trembled slightly as he held the card, and for a split second, Chris could see the officer's uncertainty written all over his face. The crowd, which had been watching with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion, began to murmur among themselves. Some people shifted closer, their faces a mix of disbelief and recognition as they saw the military ID. Whispers spread like wildfire through the onlookers. Chris wasn't just any random man on the street. He was a decorated veteran. And yet, he had been treated like a criminal. The murmurs began to grow louder, and it was clear that the crowd was starting to pick up on what was happening here. They weren't buying the officer's story anymore. "I can't believe this," one person muttered under their breath. "He's a veteran, and they're treating him like this?" Another person shook their head in disbelief. "What gives him the right to stop him like that?" As the whispers grew, a few voices rose above the rest. "You can't just stop people without reason," one bystander shouted. "What did he do wrong?" "He's not doing anything wrong." The crowd began to grow more restless, and the once muted murmurs turned into full-blown protests against Officer Thompson's actions. Chris, still standing tall and composed, could feel the shift in the crowd. The officer was no longer in control of the situation. It was clear to everyone that he had overstepped. Chris's calm demeanor remained unshaken as he looked directly at Officer Thompson. "So, officer," Chris began, his voice now carrying a note of quiet challenge. "What was the reason for stopping me? What exactly am I being accused of? I'm just trying to go about my day, but you've made me a suspect for no reason." The question hung in the air, cutting through the growing noise of the crowd. Officer Thompson's face flushed slightly, and his eyes darted around, clearly searching for a response. But none came. He couldn't answer. There was no explanation that could justify what had just transpired. Chris wasn't just a civilian being harassed. He was a man with a purpose, a life, and a reason to be out on the street. He was also someone who had earned his respect through his service, and that respect wasn't something that could be easily dismissed. The officer's inability to answer only deepened the unease among the crowd. As Chris stood there, his arms crossed, his expression calm but firm, it was clear that he wasn't going to back down. The silence stretched for a moment longer before Chris spoke again, his voice steady, almost as if he were giving Officer Thompson one last chance to explain himself. "Well, officer," Chris said, his tone polite but firm, "I think the least you could do is explain why you singled me out. Because right now, I don't see anyone else on this street getting stopped." The crowd's support for Chris only grew stronger. People in the crowd began to voice their frustrations openly. "Why is he the one being stopped? What's the real reason?" one man shouted. "You better have a damn good explanation, officer," another added. Officer Thompson, clearly flustered, opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. He had no response. The crowd had already made up their minds. They knew what they were witnessing, and they weren't going to let Officer Thompson sweep it under the rug. Officer Thompson's hands shook slightly as he unzipped Chris's backpack, his eyes scanning the contents with a mixture of determination and frustration. He pulled out the first item, a stainless steel water bottle, and held it up to the light, inspecting it as if it were a potential weapon. There was nothing suspicious about it, just a simple, practical item, like the kind anyone might carry on a day out. The officer set it aside, his eyes narrowing as if hoping to find something more significant hidden inside. Next, he pulled out a sleek black laptop, running his hands over it, as if expecting to uncover some hidden compartment. But nothing was there. It was just an ordinary laptop, the kind someone might use for work or personal use, nothing out of the ordinary. The last item in the bag was a book, neatly placed and well-worn from use. Officer Thompson hesitated for a moment as he pulled it out, its title clearly visible, Leadership Under Pressure, A SEAL's Guide to Resilience and Excellence. The title hit like a punch to the gut, and for a split second, the officer seemed to pause, unsure of what to make of it. But his confusion didn't last long. He flipped it open, scanning the pages, but found nothing to validate his actions. Chris had authored the book, something that clearly didn't fit into the narrative the officer was trying to create. The crowd had grown significantly by now, and their murmurs began to swell into soft laughter. They had been watching this whole scene unfold, and now they were starting to make sense of what was happening. People exchanged glances, some shaking their heads, while others chuckled under their breath. "That's a book about leadership," one person muttered. "And he's being treated like this?" Another voice added, a decorated veteran, treated like a criminal. "How ridiculous is this?" The once muted whispers had now turned into open ridicule of Officer Thompson's actions. Chris, however, remained unfazed. His expression was calm, even serene, as he observed the officer's futile search. He didn't feel the need to argue or make a scene. Instead, he simply stood there, arms crossed, waiting for the officer to finish his pointless inspection. The calm in Chris's demeanor contrasted sharply with the growing discomfort of Officer Thompson, whose movements had become increasingly erratic as he continued to search through the bag with no results. At this point, Chris couldn't help but speak up again. "So, officer," he began, his voice as steady and composed as ever, "you've searched my bag, you've rifled through my things, and yet you still haven't found anything suspicious. So, what was the reason for stopping me again?" The question hung in the air, cutting through the growing tension like a knife. The officer didn't respond immediately, instead opting to look at the items in front of him, as though trying to find something, anything, that could justify the stop. But there was nothing. Nothing to justify the harassment, nothing to explain why Chris had been singled out in the first place. His face flushed red, a mixture of frustration and embarrassment creeping over him. Chris's voice remained calm, but there was a sharpness to it now, a quiet challenge that made it clear he wasn't going to let this go. "What you're doing right now isn't about keeping anyone safe," Chris continued, his eyes never leaving Officer Thompson's face. "This is about you abusing your power, trying to intimidate me for no reason. And it's not going to work." As Chris spoke, the crowd's murmurs turned into a low hum of agreement. They weren't just witnessing an innocent man being unjustly detained. They were seeing an abuse of power unfold right in front of them. More phones came out, more people recorded the scene, and more voices joined in the chorus of disapproval. Officer Thompson's face tightened as he set the last item from Chris's bag back inside and zipped it up, his movements stiff and hesitant. He looked up, clearly realizing that he had no reasonable explanation for his actions, no way to justify what he had done. His authority had been undermined, not just by Chris's calm demeanor, but by the growing support of the crowd. The moment had shifted entirely, and it was clear to everyone that this wasn't about security or safety, it was about control. And in that moment, Chris had taken back control. The crowd stood behind him, their support tangible in the air, while Officer Thompson was left standing alone, his authority crumbling. Chris stood tall, his gaze unwavering as he addressed Officer Thompson, his voice cutting through the tense silence. "What you're doing right now isn't about security or keeping the streets safe," he said firmly, his words laced with frustration and dismay. "This is about power. You've singled me out for no reason, and now you're harassing me because of it." Chris took a step closer to the officer, his presence commanding. "I'm not a suspect," he continued, his voice calm but carrying a weight of authority. "I'm just a man walking down the street. But you see me and make an assumption based on nothing more than the color of my skin. That's not just unfair, it's part of a larger problem in this society. It's racism, and it's an abuse of power." The words hit like a wave, and for a moment, the officer stood there, unable to respond. His face flushed with embarrassment, and his jaw clenched as Chris's words sank in. The crowd around them, which had been quietly watching the exchange unfold, began to stir. The murmurs that had once filled the air with uncertainty now became louder, more vocal. People were beginning to see the injustice of the situation, and they weren't going to stand by and let it continue. As Chris spoke, he could feel the shift in the crowd's energy. There was a growing sense of solidarity among the onlookers, and it became clear that they were no longer passive observers. They were on Chris's side. Slowly at first, but with increasing intensity, the crowd began to clap. The sound of hands coming together echoed down the street, and soon the applause grew louder, more insistent. People shouted words of encouragement, cheering Chris on, their voices ringing with support. "He's right," someone called out. "This is wrong." Another voice joined in, "You can't just treat people like that." Chris's chest swelled with quiet pride as the crowd's support washed over him. His heart beat steadily in his chest, a reminder that he was not alone in this moment. The anger and fear that had once gripped him now seemed distant, replaced by a sense of justice. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was speaking up for everyone who had ever been wronged, who had ever been mistreated, who had ever been unfairly targeted because of their race or appearance. Officer Thompson, on the other hand, stood frozen, unable to hide the discomfort on his face. The applause and shouts from the crowd seemed to knock the wind out of him, stripping him of the authority he had tried to exert over Chris. The confidence that he had held just moments ago began to crumble, piece by piece. He looked around, but the eyes of the crowd were all on him, their phones still recording, their faces a mix of disbelief and condemnation. There was no way for him to justify his actions anymore, no excuse that could cover the truth now laid bare. The officer took a step back, his expression shifting from one of command to one of uncertainty. His gaze flickered nervously between Chris and the crowd, the pressure mounting on him from all sides. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. The silence hung in the air, thick with the weight of his failure. He had no defense, no answer to Chris's accusation. Slowly, the confidence he had once held so tightly in his posture began to dissipate, leaving only the realization that he had lost control of the situation. The crowd's voices grew louder, urging him to explain, demanding answers. "What do you have to say for yourself, officer?" someone shouted. "Why did you stop him?" Another voice added, "You've got to answer for this." The pressure on Officer Thompson was palpable. The glares from the onlookers, the constant flow of questions, and the ever-present cameras all combined to make him feel like he was suffocating under the weight of his own actions. Realizing he couldn't win this battle, Officer Thompson's posture deflated. His shoulders slumped, and his hands fell to his sides as the harsh reality of the moment set in. He had no more excuses, and the truth was undeniable. His authority had evaporated, his arrogance shattered by the collective voice of those around him. The officer stood there, utterly defeated, while Chris and the crowd had triumphed. The public had spoken, and there was no going back for Officer Thompson. As the crowd continued to watch, Chris took a deep breath and turned to Officer Thompson, his voice steady yet filled with undeniable conviction. "You know, officer," he began, "you owe me, and everyone here, an explanation. What you did today wasn't just an isolated incident. This is part of a much bigger problem. The reality is, this happens all the time to people who don't have the privilege of being able to stand their ground. And it's not just about me. It's about how people in power like you choose to treat others based on nothing more than their skin color." Chris paused for a moment, allowing his words to sink in, his eyes never leaving the officer's face. This isn't just about one bad experience. It's about racism and the abuse of power. And it's something that this society has to confront. The crowd grew even more silent at Chris's words, the weight of what he said settling over everyone. There was no denying the truth in what he was saying. This wasn't just a bad encounter. It was part of a systemic issue that needed to be addressed. As Chris continued to speak, the tension in the air shifted. What had started as a tense confrontation now felt like a call to action. I'm standing here today not just to defend myself, but to defend everyone who's ever been treated unfairly because of the color of their skin, Chris said, his voice unwavering. It's time we stop letting these things happen in silence. It's time to take a stand for what's right. His gaze swept over the crowd, making sure to meet the eyes of everyone around him. We can't keep letting this slide. We can't keep allowing people in power to misuse that power without consequence. If we don't stand up, nothing will change. The words hung in the air, powerful and urgent. The crowd, who had already been supporting him, now erupted into louder applause, their voices rising in agreement. The message was clear. This wasn't just about one person being wronged, but about a call for justice that extended to everyone, everywhere. The crowd had now become an active participant in Chris's fight, a fight that was bigger than just the moment they were in. Chris turned back to Officer Thompson, who was still standing there, looking more defeated than ever. You know, Chris said, his tone softer but still carrying weight, you have a responsibility as a police officer to protect and serve, not to intimidate and abuse your power. When you stop someone based on assumptions, when you treat them like a criminal without cause, you're failing to do your job. And today, you failed. The officer opened his mouth, but no words came out. His defense had crumbled long ago, and now there was nothing left to say. He had no justification for his actions, no way to escape the reality of what had happened. The crowd's collective disapproval was overwhelming, and he knew that, despite any badge or uniform, his authority had been shattered. Chris's final words carried a message that was meant not just for Officer Thompson, but for everyone who had been watching. This isn't just about me or this interaction. This is about all of us, about justice, fairness, and the fight against abuse of power. We all have a role to play in making this society a better place for everyone. If we stay silent, if we allow things like this to happen, then we are complicit. But if we speak up, if we demand change, we can make a difference. As Chris finished speaking, the crowd stood in unison, their applause echoing down the street, louder than ever. They had witnessed something rare, a moment when an individual refused to back down, when a man stood up against the wrongs of the world and demanded justice. The message was clear. Everyone has the right to stand up for themselves, and no one should ever allow discrimination or the abuse of power to go unchecked. For the American audience watching, the lesson was evident. The fight for justice and fairness is ongoing, and it is something that everyone must be actively involved in. It's about standing firm, demanding equality, and never allowing anyone to misuse their position of power to harm others. Everyone has a role to play in ensuring that society is just, and it's time to take that responsibility seriously. Chris had done that, and in doing so, he had shown the power of one voice standing up for what's right.